Ever find yourself wondering about stuff most people don't even think to ask about?
You mean
Like why there are all these different versions of the Bible out there?
oh yeah, that's a good one. You'd think something like the Bible would be, the Bible.
Exactly. But it turns out it's way more interesting than that.
It's a total rabbit hole, right?
Totally. So we're going to take a deep dive into why there are different versions of the Bible, especially within Christianity.
Sounds good to me.
I think a lot of folks, even if they grew up with the Bible, probably don't realize how those different versions came to be.
It's not something you just pick up in, Sunday school.
Definitely not. And we're not just talking about different translations here.
Right, like going from King James to, what's that modern one?
The Mets?
Yeah, the Message or something. We're talking about entirely different books being included or left out.
Exactly. So buckle up, everyone, because this is going to be a wild ride through history.
It all starts even before we get to the Gospels.
Oh, you mean with the Hebrew Bible?
Bingo, the one they call the Tanakh.
All right, so back to basics then. For those who don't know, what is the Tanakh?
So picture this. It's a collection of ancient texts written over centuries.
Like scrolls and stuff.
Yeah, basically. And they form the foundation of the Jewish faith.
Okay, I'm with you.
So
Right.
this collection, this Tanakh, it's kind of like a library.
A library, huh?
Yeah, with three main sections.
Okay, so like different genres.
Sort of. You got the Torah, which is the law. Think Moses and the Ten Commandments.
Got it. Everyone knows about those.
Then you've got the Nevi'im, which are the writings of the prophets.
Offering guidance, warnings, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And lastly, there's the Ketuvim, which includes everything else.
The best of compilation.
Pretty much. Stuff like Psalms, Proverbs, all considered super important.
Okay, I'm starting to see the picture here.
By about the 1st century CE, those 24 books were pretty much set in stone for the Jewish people as their scriptures.
So this Tanakh, these 24 books, that's like our starting point, right?
Right. The foundation.
But then how do we go from one set of texts to multiple versions of the Bible? I mean, how did that even happen?
That's where things get really interesting. This is where the Septuagint comes in.
Septuagint. Okay, I've heard that name before, but
It's a mouthful, right? But it's crucial to this whole story. See, back around the 3rd century BCE,
BCE. So we're talking way before Jesus here.
way before. So back then, you've got a lot of Jewish folks, especially over in Alexandria, Egypt, who primarily speak Greek.
Because of Alexander the Great and all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Greek was like the English of its day. So you need a translation of the Hebrew Bible, right? Make it accessible. That's where the Septuagint comes in.
Makes sense. Not everyone back then would have been fluent in ancient Hebrew.
And that's where things get even more interesting.
Oh. It's not just a word-for-word translation.
Nope, not at all. The Septuagint, it's a translation, sure, but it also throws in some bonus content.
Hold on. Bonus content, like director's cut footage.
Kind of. We're talking additional books and writings here, stuff that you don't actually find in the Hebrew Bible.
You're kidding.
Yeah.
So right off the bat, before Christianity even spreads, there are already two versions of what we might call the Old Testament floating around.
You got it.
Wow. That right there seems like it would cause some confusion later on.
Oh, yeah, you could say that again. This difference, it's super important because it sets the stage for some big, big questions about what actually belongs in the Bible. We're talking canonization and a whole lot of debate.
So who gets to decide which books are actually official? Like, was there a committee or something?
Well, imagine trying to decide which ancient scrolls were actually divinely inspired. That's basically what they were grappling with.
Wow, that's a heavy responsibility.
Tell me about it. That whole process, it's called canonization.
Canonization. Sounds kind of like making a playlist, but for, like, sacred texts instead of songs.
That's a great way to put it. Both Jewish and Christian traditions went through this process of figuring out which books were in and which were out. Problem is, they didn't always agree.
So even way back then, there were already different ideas about what was truly scripture. No wonder we ended up with different versions of the Bible.
Exactly. And this difference in how they formed their canons, that's a big part of what plays out later, especially during stuff like the Protestant Reformation.
This is already so fascinating. We've got early translations with extra books, debates about which books are divinely inspired. It's like a historical thriller or something. But before we get to the Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox versions of the Bible, let's take a quick break. And we're back, folks. Still digging into all those different versions of the Bible out there.
It's more than just an interesting history lesson, though, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There are real differences between these Bibles that people use today.
And it all goes back to what we were talking about before the break with the Septuagint and canonization.
Right, those extra books, and who decided what was official scripture.
And that's a big part of what explodes during the Protestant Reformation.
Ah, yes. Martin Luther and his 95 Theses.
Talk about shaking things up.
For sure. But how did that lead to a whole different version of the Bible?
Well, one of the big things Luther and the Reformers emphasized was this idea of sola scriptura.
Sola Scriptura. That sounds serious.
It was. It means scripture alone. Basically, they were saying that the Bible is the ultimate authority, not tradition or the Pope or anything else.
So they wanted to go back to basics, back to the original source.
Exactly. And for them, that meant the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh.
So what happened to all those extra books in the Septuagint, the ones that Catholics have been using?
Well, those became a big point of contention.
Because the Protestants didn't think they were legit.
Basically, yeah. They might be interesting from a historical perspective, but not divinely inspired in the same way as the Hebrew Bible.
So they kicked them out.
Yep. That's why the Protestant Bible has 66 books, just like the Hebrew Bible.
Okay, that makes sense for the Protestants, but what about the Catholic Church? They had been using those extra books for centuries.
And they weren't about to just toss them out. They saw those books as a vital part of their tradition and understanding of Scripture.
It's like they were working with a bigger puzzle, and those extra pieces fit in for them.
Exactly. They call those books deuterocanonical.
Deuterocanonical, got it.
Okay.
So you've got Protestants going back to the Hebrew Bible and Catholics sticking with their traditional version. What about the Eastern Orthodox Church? They have their own Bible too, right?
They sure do. And they also place a ton of importance on the Septuagint,
So more extra books.
sometimes even more than the Catholic Bible.
Wow. We've got multiple versions of the Old Testament floating around. At least the New Testament is the same for everyone, right?
You might think so, but remember, the early Christians relied heavily on that Septuagint translation.
Oh, right. So the language and ideas from those extra Old Testament books, they actually influenced how early Christians understood Jesus.
Exactly. This isn't just about the number of books. These variations reflect fundamentally different ways of understanding the faith itself.
Wow, that's kind of mind-blowing. So how do we make sense of all this? It's easy to get lost in the weeds.
I think the key is to remember that these differences aren't arbitrary. They're rooted in different views on authority and how we interpret sacred texts.
Okay, so walk me through that.
Well, we talked about the Protestant emphasis on sola scriptura. For them, the Hebrew Bible is the ultimate authority.
Got it.
Catholics and Orthodox Christians, on the other hand, place more value on tradition and the role of the church in interpreting Scripture.
And since they were using the Septuagint all along.
Exactly. It became a cornerstone of their tradition.
You know, this reminds me of something like sometimes I'll read a news article and then my friend will read the same article and come away with a totally different interpretation.
Oh, I know that feeling. Especially these days.
It's like, are we even reading the same thing?
Yeah,
But it's because we come to it with different experiences and biases.
exactly. And it's fascinating how similar dynamics are at play here, even with something as ancient and influential as the Bible.
It's not just ancient history, though, is it?
Yeah.
This whole idea of where we find authority, how we interpret tradition, that's something we all grapple with every day, right?
All the time. And not just with religion either. Think about politics, relationships, even just deciding where to eat lunch.
Wow, you're right. This deep dive into the Bible has really opened up a can of worms.
And we're not even done yet.
True that. Before we get too far down that rabbit hole, let's take a quick break to process all this. We'll be back in a flash. All right, we're back. Time to wrap up this deep dive into the wild world of, well, the Bible.
And all those different versions out there.
It's been quite a journey. We've gone from ancient scrolls to Martin Luther.
And everything in between.
It's easy to get lost in the details, but I think the big takeaway here is that these variations, they're more than just interesting historical footnotes.
Oh, absolutely. They represent real differences in how people understand faith, authority, even how we interpret sacred texts.
It's like we've been comparing different maps of the same territory,
Exactly. Each one might highlight different landmarks or routes.
but they all ultimately point toward the same destination.
And just like with those maps, understanding why those different perspectives exist, it gives us a much richer appreciation for the complexities of religious tradition.
So it's not about saying one version of the Bible is right and the others are wrong.
Not at all. It's about recognizing that these variations come from centuries of sincere wrestling with questions that are still relevant today.
Questions like, where do we locate authority?
How much weight do we give to tradition? What shapes our understanding of faith? Those are questions for everyone, not just theologians.
It really makes you think beyond just memorizing how many books are in each Bible.
It sure does. And speaking of fascinating details, remember we touched on the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible earlier, with the most books out of any version.
Yeah, 81 books, a lot of reading.
It really is. And some of those extra books, like the Book of Enoch, they give us this whole other glimpse into ancient Jewish beliefs and traditions.
Stuff that didn't make it into the other canons.
Exactly. It's like a window into a whole world of thought that we might not otherwise know about.
That's so cool. It really makes you wonder what other stories or perspectives might be out there waiting to be rediscovered.
And that's the beauty of it, isn't it? This journey of learning and discovery, it never really ends. This deep dive is just one starting point.
Well said. You know, what seemed like a simple topic on the surface, different versions of the Bible, it's turned out to be one of our most thought-provoking deep dives yet.
It just goes to show that sometimes the most familiar things have the greatest potential to surprise us.
Absolutely. So, to all our listeners out there, next time you see a Bible, don't just see a book.
See a whole tapestry.
Woven from centuries of history, debate, and faith.
It's a powerful thing. And hey, if you're feeling adventurous,
Maybe track down a copy of that Ethiopian Orthodox Bible.
I'd love to hear what you think. But for now, until next time,
Keep those questions coming.
keep diving deep.